Good afternoon. Welcome to the third session. Today, my name is Maya Gonzalez, and I'm here to introduce Sami Kati. He's an assistant professor of visual arts at the American University of Cairo and member of the Mellon research group Extimacies, Critical Theory from the Global South. He is also a founding member of the Beirut Institute for Critical Analysis and Research, BICAR. His ongoing research projects, Aesthetics of the Sensuous Supersensuous, examines the aesthetic scope and political relevance of Marx's discovery of the commodity form.
You can also introduce Nadia as well.
On my right, Andrea Zepnik is a senior lecturer at the University of Manchester. Her research focuses on the questions of political mobilization and race. Theoretically, her work draws on post-colonial and critical theory and psychoanalysis, while empirically, her focus is in particular on Black communities in the US and the Roma community in Europe. Her publications include Lacan, Deleuze, and World Politics, and edited collections such as Politics of Anxiety, Deleuze Lacan, A Disjunctive Synthesis, and Jacques Lacan, Between Politics and Psychoanalysis, edited with Samo Tomšić.
Let's start.
Thank you, Maya, for this kind introduction. And even though I'm also a member of the group, I should thank Surti and Nadia for making this possible. This almost one week, postponed critical theory festival /meeting in Beirut. I'm going to read out a kind of dense paper that will. Sorry. Yes. No, it's okay. No one will be injured. Kind of a condensed version of a longer paper that soon will be published with a volume of Lüneburg University's Culture of Critique research group. And already this one stands in a series of papers and publications that try to make sense of the logical and temporal structure of the commodity form in Marx. So it's roughly 8 years I'm trying to get rid of this topic, but I don't succeed, so I still produce on that. An earlier version of that paper is actually indebted to Maya Gonzalez to my right. We edited the last version together, and as you will see, a lot of the second part of this paper is also indebted to Samo Tomšić's book on Marx and Lacan. It's going to be very uncomfortable if I do this. Is it okay if I speak like this? Super, I would like to do this. Okay, let's start. This paper is called in this version Real Abstraction and the Unconscious of the Commodity Form. In Das Kapital, Marx distinguishes his approach from the one of classical political economy in the following way. And I quote, "Political economy has indeed analyzed value and its magnitude, however incompletely, and has uncovered the content concealed within these forms. But it has never once asked the question why this content has assumed that particular form. That is to say, why labor is expressed in value and why the measurement of labor by its duration is expressed in the magnitude of the value of the product." So the project of the critique of political economy is thus a matter of form and less of content. Against a merely genealogical misreading, we should insist that Marx's scientific discovery is not about how capitalism and its major social relations historically came into being. Rather, the scope and stakes of Marx's entire critical project are defined by the question of how to theoretically present the value form of the commodity, and particularly the commodity form of labor power. As Michael Heinrich rightly comments, Marx is not predominantly criticizing the conclusions of political economy, but rather the manner in which it poses questions. Changing, that's end of quote. So changing the questions and research perspective, Marx does not only engage in an immanent critique of previous classical liberal theories of political economy, rather his critique seeks to, it's also a quote from Michael Heinrich, to break down the theoretical field, meaning the self-evident views and spontaneously arising notions to which the categories of political economy owe their apparent plausibility. Marx's epistemological break with the categories, research questions, perspectives, and findings of traditional political economy, ranging normally seen from Adam Smith to David Ricardo, defines critique as a practice of transformative reading that changes the criticized content on the level of the constitution of its scientific object. In other words, the object and subject matter of the critique of political economy is not simply out there, but has to be produced by way of a critical method. By exposing the epistemic blind spot of the criticized theoretical field, Marx presents his own dialectical method and constitutes the scientific objects of his inquiry. It's basically, in short terms, you can just say, I don't think that there is something like a Marxian version of political economy, but there is a critique of political economy that was produced at the same time or just before Marx. So it's not so much that I read him as a theorist of political economy. And the difference between a theory of political economy and a critique of the entire epistemic field is basically what frames this paper. So let us consider the first sentence of Capital 1. We all know that. The wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears, in German erscheint, as an immense collection of commodities. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form. How then are we to discriminate between the levels of appearance, Erscheinung, and essence, Wesen, without relegating Marx's critical project to the binary logics or dualistic metaphysics? What is the categorical and historical genesis of the commodity's essence, and why can it only appear in this form? In fact, as Hans-Georg Backhaus put it, quote, the dialectical method cannot be restricted to leading the form of appearance back to the essence. It must show, in addition, why the essence assumes precisely this or that form of appearance. The commodity, as an abstract yet real category of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails, appears at first sight as, quote Marx, an extremely obvious, trivial thing. However, as he is quickly to tell his readers, as soon as it emerges as a commodity, it changes into a sensuous, supra-sensuous thing, sinnlich übersinnliches Ding, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. Indeed, in the sensuous world, the commodity appears as one thing among other things. Yet at the same time, it has acquired supra-sensuous or metaphysical properties. These real yet supra-sensuous or non-empirical properties cannot appear as such. They pertain to the specific social form through which the commodity appears. Commodities acquire the capacity of being exchangeable due to essential value relations that only appear on these commodities in their mutual exchange relations or intercourse, Verkehr. This mode of appearance does not pose a merely epistemological problem, but relates to the split character of capitalist reality and the ontological status of its ruling social form, the commodity form. Unpacking the intricacies of the value dimension of commodities, Marx, in the first edition of Capital 1 in 1867, introduced an intriguing image. I'm always using this, but I do it one more time. And this is more or less my translation of this short passage. It is as if alongside an external to reliance tigers, rabbits, and all other actual animals, which form when grouped together the various kinds, species, subspecies, families, etc. of the animal kingdom, there existed also, in addition, the animal, the individual incarnation of the entire animal kingdom. The problem of the value form of the commodity cannot be explained hence on the level of empiricist economy only, which simply counts and accounts for concrete animals. The value of a commodity is expressed in money, and as money, the commodity redoubles itself into two seemingly independent existences. As a specific commodity, or as lions, tigers, rabbits, the commodity exists in the sensuous world. However, as value expressed in money, as the animal, it also exists in a non- or supra-sensuous way along and additionally to its sensuous mode of existence. The problem of form and the stakes of critique hence can be summarized as the challenge of presenting the mode of existence of these two dimensions of the commodity and the dialectical or sensuous, supra-sensuous unity of the commodity form. As we shall see, it would be utterly wrong to assume that one dimension of the commodity is concrete and really existing as sensuous content, while the other is just abstract and conceptual as a supra-sensuous form or just attached to it externally. To complicate matters further, neither dimension is derived from the other in a deductive or inductive manner, but how then to present the commodity form? Marx's well-known entry point is the split or dual nature of the commodity, use value and exchange value. Whereas the former seems unproblematic as long as it refers to an empirical thing satisfying a determined human need, and by the way, it's not unproblematic at all, but I just skipped that. Exchange value expresses an abstract social category, economic value. Exchange value is the form of appearance of value, as Marx defines it. It designates the merely quantitative value relation of one commodity vis-à-vis another commodity as relational difference. From the presentation of the dual nature of the commodity, Marx quickly moves on to the next categorical level of redoubling. The labor that produces the commodity has also two sides, concrete and abstract labor. While use values are produced by concrete labor measured by concrete labor time or chronometric time like this watch, the very act of concrete production also produces value. Value is produced by abstract or abstract human labor, which exceeds linear chronometric measurement. However, in real time, these two acts of production are the same. Abstract labor designates a social relation between different expenditures of labor power materialized in the results of this expenditure. Or put differently, the concrete use value dimension of labor does not come into being independently of its abstract value producing dimension. However, on the market they appear as two independent, if not antagonistic entities endowed with a life of their own. The commodity exists as a commodity thing and as money, and we should add, of course, as debt and derivatives, capital, and so on. Or it exists as we can count tiger, rabbits, and so on, and as the animal and all the derivatives. You can say the doppelgangers and derivatives of the animal. So hence the scandal of capitalist ontology resides in the obscure fact that really existing abstractions exist in the same world as their form of appearance. The surface of concrete reality is made of really existing abstractions, and it is this concrete surface of commodity relations that is essential in the precise sense of presenting an ensemble of concrete, like from concrescere, like grown together abstract relations. In this way, the real essence of the commodity form and its real abstractions appears as an immense collection of commodities, the individual commodity as its elementary form. But how are we to understand the ontological and epistemological status of this peculiar as-if existence of the dimension of value, Or to put it differently, what is the commodity form actually made of? And of course, there's a huge bracket now that I skip here. It's a reading of that famous fragment on method from the Grundrisse, where Marx explains his scientific method or dialectical method of not abstracting from a supposed already existing world and then, ascending to some mere thin abstractions, but producing these abstract relations first and grow them together, like the meaning of Kongressgehör indicates. This I skip. I also skip another huge footnote, which would be what is actually the dimension of value, which never pertains to any kind of homeostasis, even though there is an equation sign in every exchange of equivalence. As we know, surplus value or surplus becomes before value, logically, even though it seems value is produced and surplus as an add-on is somehow later added to it or stolen from someone in a successive manner. Of course, that's not the case. We will see later why. I think yesterday Bladen put it this way, why 2 becomes before 1. But I skip this and just move on to Sonretel here. So for Marx, form does not designate a stable entity bound to ahistorical logics or pure transcendental forms. For Marx, as Alfred Sonretel reminds us, form is time-bound. It originates, dies, and changes within time. End of quote. Without going into the details of Sonretel's otherwise problematic reading of Marx with Kant and against Hegel, we can draw a crucial insight here. For Marx's dialectical materialism, form does not only change within time, time as form is also a historically produced form. The interaction of the time of natural and human history, as Sonretel put it, and the level of time as a historically produced and changing form renders it impossible to give a linear account on how capitalism, its forms and categories came once upon a time into being. And of course, a close reading of Marx's chapter on ursprüngliche Akkumulation, geniusly mistranslated as primitive accumulation, should be actually primal or originary accumulation, could start here. And in a way also, I won't do this of course, but it's quite telling that for this kind of once upon a time fairy tale historicity, the temporal form of the myth or fairy tale is the most properly scientific one. Everything else as a scientific account, almost like as these instrumentalist fantasies about when did Homo erectus actually start language or something like that. This should be criticized. I think the temporal form of myth is the only one that has a little scientific value here. But again, this is another paper and also another problematic topic. So I stick to the issue of form here. If form is time-bound and also the historical expression of the social production of time as form, we can think of form as a changing social relation which contains its own unhistoricizable historicity, while producing at the same time historical time. This peculiar historicity is unhistoricizable because the standard of historicization, or time as chronometric measurement, diachronic sequentiality and so on, is itself produced by and through it. Assuming an unhistoricizable historicity of socially valid forms does not imply their eternalization, or even worse, ontologization. However, this historicity cannot be told in a linear way either. So much about the genealogists' misunderstanding of what is Marx's project. So what then is the epistemological and ontological status of an unhistoricizable historicity? If this unhistoricizable historicity is not simply something untold, forgotten, or unaccounted for, which could be accounted for at least in theory, but repressed in a structural sense, it always escapes the presentation of its historical diachronic genesis. So it is the main point of this paper to argue that the peculiar historicity of the commodity form is structurally repressed and real. It does not spring from the intellectual realm of syllogisms or Kantian antinomies of pure reason. Apparently, neither the discourse of political economy nor the one of philosophical epistemology can provide us here with a model. However, if we change the discourse terrain and turn to a different field of knowledge, we may find a structure of argument that could elucidate the logical temporality at work here. Of course, no surprise now, especially at this conference. In Freudian psychoanalysis, the ontological status of Urverdrängung, or primal or originary repression, is precisely this: an event that is real but exists only in its status as repressed. Or originary repression is real only insofar as it has real effects. It exists in effects only, if you want. Yet it comes before that which is being repressed. Or put differently, it cannot be told or made conscious because the prefix ur, or originary, indicates the quasi-transcendental status of primariness, a primariness that comes logically before anything historical can be repressed. As Freud insists, quote, repression is not a defensive mechanism which is present from the very beginning, and that it cannot arise until a sharp cleavage or Sonderung has occurred between conscious and unconscious mental activity, that the essence of repression lies simply in turning something away and keeping it at a distance from the conscious. In other words, originary repression is unconscious in a different way than particular repressed mental states, which could be symbolized in the process of the psychoanalytical cure and whose returning symptoms can be made conscious, at least theoretically. Or, to quote from Samo Tomšic's book on Marx and Lacan, repression already presupposes the unconscious, and its function does not consist so much in suppressing, inhibiting, or hindering satisfaction, but in keeping the drive away from consciousness. The paradox of repression lies in the fact that repression is secondary, despite being constitutive of the repressed. It can only emerge after the scission of the mental apparatus between consciousness and unconscious has been established, but it is also the necessary condition of this cleavage. So if we, and following Samo's book, if we distinguish between constitutive repression, or Urverdrängung is constitutive of repression, and constituted repression, repressed content and its mode of returning in form of symptoms, which can be subject to the psychoanalytic cure, we have a homological model to come to terms with the ontological status of an unhistoricizable historicity, which is both secondary to and constitutive of the history of the commodity form, that is, the historical formation of capitalist relations of production. Again, this is in much more complicated term, reiterating a very simple point that was made, actually not simple point, but a crucial point that cannot be repeated enough. If you want to give a genealogical account on what is otherwise seen as whatever transcendental or ahistorical logical forms, you cannot relapse into a sequential, a linear logic, but you have to allow what otherwise may be called retroactivity, or kind of a constitutive second step that is in a way primary, that retroactively intervenes in the chain, in the causal chain of events, that you cannot tell causality in a linear way. This is basically what I mean with this strange term, unhistoricizable historicity. So the unhistoricizable historicity of the commodity form can only emerge once we are already in capitalism. Yet the ontological status of assuming an unhistoricizable historicity structurally conditions the split in capitalist reality that Marx theorized in terms of the dual character of the commodity, the dual character of labor, and the redoubling of the commodity as commodity or animals, and money, the animal. So speaking of an unhistoricizable historicity of the commodity form is nothing else than taking a real yet unconscious historicity of capitalist history into account, which in the first place produced these socially valid forms. Or in other words, we can allow for the possibility of forms that are not generated by the conscious mind of conceptual thought. Instead, we are pointing to forms that exist in an abstract manner, forms that are not reducible to any empirical historical subject and his or her intellectual faculties. Accounting for an unaccountable, and that is unhistoricizable, historicity of socially valid forms, we could also speak of an unconscious of form, or to borrow a term from Slavoj Žižek, of the problem of the unconscious of the commodity form, in distinction to the unconscious content of capitalist history. And this could be, of course, repressed events or counter-hegemonic struggles, or a kind of whole narrative of counter-historical events that took place yet are in the dominant form of historiography are repressed. This is also a common way of reading Benjamin's point on the tradition of the oppressed, even though I dispute this reading. I think he's also on both sides on constituted repression and constitutive repression, but that's another topic. But a huge footnote on Benjamin and Foucault could actually start here. So the unconscious of the commodity would then be another term for constitutive repression, whereas repressed events of history could be read as constituted repression. With the notions of constitutive repression and the unconscious of the commodity form, we finally arrive at the ontological status of the real abstract character of the value form of the commodity in distinction to thought abstractions. As Sonretel put it, quote, "While the abstractions of natural science are thought abstractions, the economic concept of value is a real one. It exists nowhere other than in the human mind, but it does not spring from it." Of course, nowhere other than the human mind is also a very, let's say, unfortunate formulation. Though as paradoxical as it sounds, the commodity form assumes the form of thought, exists in thought, yet does not originate or spring from it. Sonretel's characterization of the value form of the commodity gives us a possible definition of what the unconscious of the commodity form could be. Value that is a denaturalized or literally abstracted social relation comes into being by virtue of a real process of exchange, an actually performed equation of things as commodities, which acquires at the same time the form of thought, that is, abstraction. Again, this is a quote from Sonretel. Wherever commodity exchange takes place, it does so in effective abstraction from use. This is an abstraction not in mind, but in fact. End of quote. Value can only appear in accordance with the conscious form of thought, intellectual abstraction. However, its kind of dark or unaccountable, unhistoricizable historicity points to a really performed abstraction outside of the conscious mind, which only retroactively conforms to the forms of the mind. Of course, historically, before thought could arrive at pure abstraction, the abstraction was already at work in socially effective on the market. The critical kernel of Sonretel's argument, however, goes beyond a disputable analysis of the historical genesis of abstract thought out of the first socially valid coinage systems and exchange economies, dating back to ancient Greece and, of course, the famous Phoenicians. And then you can, of course, debate whether they're first the coinage system or the alphabet or the book or all together, and what came first. But I think there is not much value in determining what comes first if you have this linear narrative. But with Sonretel's reading of Marx, we are to ask what is the status of that form of thought, and here a quote from Zizek, whose ontological status is not that of thought. So in case of abstract labor, we can conclude that it has the form of thought, but owes its existence to an unconscious mode of social intercourse, Verkehr, exchange, which becomes conscious only at a different side, namely in the mind as intellectual abstraction, almost like a screen. So in his reading of Marx, Freud and Sonretel, Zizek, in a very, very early book, takes the formula, the form of thought whose ontological status is not that of thought, as one of the possible definitions of the unconscious. In this way, real abstraction becomes the unconscious operator and mediator of the form of abstract thought, logically prior to abstract thought content. As a quasi-transcendental and seemingly timeless ahistorical form of thought, real abstraction necessarily remains unconscious. It cannot acquire a conscious history without losing its quasi-transcendental status as originally repressed. In other words, the ontological status of the real abstraction performed by commodity relations remains unconscious in a radical way. It points to the unconscious of the commodity form, to an unconscious form which only appears in the mind as necessarily timeless and ahistorical, i.e. as the Kantian transcendental forms of pure thinking, quantity-quality relation modality, and pure intuition, or time and space. Of course, we cannot deny the fact that the concept of abstract labor, which stands in the center of Marx's presentation of the commodity form, conforms to the logical and aesthetic forms of the Kantian transcendental subject. However, this epistemological status of conformity does not tell us anything about its ontological status and the genealogical question about how abstract labor came into being. 3 more minutes. You didn't say anything. With Marx, we can conclude that form as changing in and with time remains unconscious and constitutively repressed. Otherwise, the commodity form would relapse either to a historical form without epistemological consequences or to a purely ahistorical concept without historical determinations. Grasping real abstraction as the unconscious of the commodity form makes us understand that form is never reducible to conscious abstractions of the intellect only. If the commodity is a sensuous, supra-sensuous thing, we can conclude that the commodity is the sensuously perceptible and intellectually conceivable object that owes its existence to an unconscious dimension. And if the commodity form is and its unconscious kernel, that is real abstraction, contain an unaccountable, unhistoricizable historicity whose ontological status and logical temporality can be understood in homology to originary or constitutive repression and Freudian psychoanalysis, we can eventually ask the question about the constituted repression enacted and displaced by capitalist relations of production. The dimension of value and abstract labor symptomatically points to and at the same time occludes the repressed history of an unconscious subject. Labor power is the unconscious subject of value that keeps on bringing the commodity form into being. For the later marks of capital, this subject is not stable or always already existing, but precariously produced as the bearer of labor power, that is the proletariat. Whereas the commodity form is real, abstract, and general, the proletariat is really universal and singular. Or in Samu's words, quote, it's the same book on Marx and Lacan, the proletariat is a particular type of the universal, a singular universal which stands opposite to the abstract and false universalism of the general equivalent and the commodity form. End of quote. And if you want, you can say this is the proletariat stands as a singular universal opposite of what we could call the globalization or the global the global aspect of the commodity form. This opposition is asymmetric in the sense of the asymmetry implied in the exchange relation of the value of the commodity of the commodity of labor power, that is wage, and the value produced by the application of labor power in the production process, surplus value, capital, and so on. Or you can say it's the difference between debtor and creditor. It's not a symmetric one. So the history of the proletariat, of course, according to Marx, here we agree, is class struggle. Yet this history is repressed. The repressed history of class struggle pertains to an ongoing history of constituted repression. It can only be cured in the labor of working through the 5 lines. It can only be cured in the labor of working through the conditions of its repression by symbolizing and displacing class antagonism in a series of revolutions and revolutionary defeats. Such struggles for a revolutionary cure, however, do not necessarily abolish the level of constitutive repression enacted by and through the commodity form. Ultimately, we arrive at a seemingly circular conclusion. The unhistoricizable historicity of the commodity form structurally conditions and represses the negative history of an unconscious subject, the proletariat, without which the commodity form could have never come into being in the first place. However, this seemingly circular conclusion is itself the effect of the primal separation or originary cleavage of an unconscious historicity and a conscious history. It is the ontological inconsistency of this cleavage that is addressed in Marx's concept of the commodity form. And here I end. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, would you like me to keep time?
Yes, please. That'll be lovely. Thank you.
How much time do you want?
I'll never ask that question. 30 minutes.
Yes, that's right.
It might be 30. It might be 35, but
Do you want me to indicate 5 minutes?
yes, that'd be great. Thank you. Great. Well, thanks for this opportunity. I'm really delighted to be here. So in this presentation, I'm trying to explore the relationship between anxiety and political action. And I do this by drawing a little bit in the context of kind of racial justice movements in the US, the very, very end, if we get to that. Also, I should say that this is a much longer text or exposition of my thinking, and I'm kind of trying to summarize the key parts in this presentation. Also, I start with a more of a kind of a political goal, I suppose. So there, in that sense, what I mean by that is that I mobilize a number of concepts at the beginning to kind of to get to a particular point in which I can then say something about the particular event. So I have a slightly different presentation to those that we just heard. Right. So to just kind of outline the context in how I consider or approach the question of political action and protest. Of course, I draw on here on Lacan, and in the discourse of direct political action. I mean, the discourse of direct political action often mobilizes kind of and really mythologizes 1968. In the midst of those protests, as we know, Jacques Lacan voiced a rather provocative statement, which students met with, some dismay, let's say. He stated, "What you aspire to as revolutionaries is a new master, and you will get one." Now, while Lacan was supportive of was not unsupportive of the protest, he was not blind to what he called the jouissance attained through act of resistance to authority. And in what was later called the discourse of the hysteric, Lacan explained how the desire to change the system, start a revolution, can turn against itself because those participating in political action are seduced by the enjoyment derived from their refusal to recognize authority. However, in such an act, the political action is reduced to a negative form. That is, those taking actions know what they do not want, but they are unclear of that which they would put in place in the place of the existing authority. And here perhaps, and also somehow wrongly I suppose, I assume the oneness, or in a way the localability of power or of authority. So while such an attitude towards authority is not uncommon, in the context of revolutions, Lacan found that somewhat problematic. His work suggests that protest based on a refusal to recognize authority will not lead to what appears to be a desired outcome, a change in the system. In Lacan's words from 1968, the revolutions will only lead to the institution of a new master, suggesting that a political action needs to alter the structure of the institution, not only its face. So Lacan's observation about these political structures in general is not new. However, it points out a difference between what can be described as taking a political action and acting politically. While taking a political action suggests participation in politics and in it a reaffirmation of the existing political structures, acting politically, in contrast, suggests something altogether different. It suggests an engagement with political structures that disturb, permutate, and perhaps even destroy the predominant way of doing politics. Despite a different intent, most practices of political protest fall under political action, so the former. This is not to say that political actions are always pointless or useless, but that when thinking about changes in political structures or delegitimation of authority, work on the political subject, the structure producing its subjects, and the knowledge mapping the existing political imaginaries can best determine the conditions of acting politically. So then, if acting politically is the same as what Lacan would consider resisting, then the first task of unpacking the limits of possibility within which acting politically can take place, and this is how I also proceed in this paper, needs to concern the institution of the subject. That is, who is the subject that can act politically, and the imaginaries of acting politically. That is how the subject results its agency. Now, in this paper, I bring in anxiety because it just allows me to then draw in on the two particular modes of action, so the acting out and passage à l'acte, and I kind of then map those two onto the two actions that I just kind of outlined or kind of hinted towards, so the actions of acting politically and taking a political action. But however, those two particular actions or strategies of acting allow to constitute or to bring about two different political realities, and then can kind of help us determine the strategies for understanding political action. So I'm going to skip a lot of the first part of the paper, but basically what I do, just to give an idea, is to first I kind of talk about what or who or how is the subject or political subject constituted, and here I draw on Lacan's graph of desire, and really emphasize the significance of recognition or retroactivity in that moment of institution of subjectivity. And in doing so, I also bring in the work of Shashradri Crooks and Dan Fanon, because I really want to draw out the kind of the notion of whiteness or the kind of the notion of racialization of subjectivity or the racialization of the body. And then I move on to speak about particularly the notion of interpellation and misinterpellation. So what is it that this is quite a standard account of sociopolitical subjectivity of subject formation. I still argue that this is significant in the context of racialized subjects and political actions, because the racialization, because the interpellation in the context of racialization does not work in the same way. And to do that, I again continue working with the graph of desire, and in particular, obviously, as we know, the question of but what do you want from me, and the idea of fantasy that surrounds that. So this exposition really brings me to then to the moment where I then introduce the notion of fantasy and misinterpellation. And I'm just going to return to the paper at this point. Here I quote Zizek, because I think he does best explain this in a way. And he says that the fantasy is an attempt to fill out the gap of the question with an answer. So the fantasy functions as a construction of an imaginary scenario, filling out the void. And end of quote. Fantasy secures and reassures the subject of the necessities of its mandate. And again, paraphrasing Zizek here, by giving us a definite answer to the question, what does the other want? Fantasy enables us to evade the unbearable deadlock in which the other wants something from us. And as Zizek writes, but we are at the same time incapable of translating that desire of the other into a positive interpretation, into a mandate with which to identify. So the understanding of the relationship between the subject and the signifier, or the senses, the authority, and the role the fantasy plays in the socio-political sphere in the context of political activism taking political actions is important for two reasons. First, it sheds light on what Lacan meant in this statement, so resist but all you will get is a new master. So the statement no longer appears as an over-pessimistic judgment, but as a call to the cautious, to be cautious before making revolutionary proclamations. The subject is existentially intertwined in a relationship with the sovereign, that nothing but a radical break with the logic of the relationship will emancipate the subject. And secondly, it lays out the theoretical framework which determines who is recognized and interpolated. If the political subject is to... Is that better? Sorry. Oh, sorry. If the political subject is to act politically, as is the aim of revolutionary movements, then subject's action put under question not only the existence of the figure of authority, but also the existence of the political subject itself. In breaking away from the logic of authority, the subject changes the framework within which it can be interpolated, or as James Martel, on whose work I also draw here quite a bit, suggests, in revolutionary emancipatory actions, the subject is misinterpolated. And this moment of misinterpolation is important because as such it shows how a subject can perform a subversive act without breaking the logic of recognition. So what does this misinterpolation really stand for? So, drawing on the works of Fanon, Martel locates this discussion of misinterpolation in Haitian Revolution. For Martel and others, Haitian Revolution is a prime example of a subversive political action because a group of people who was not meant to respond to the call responded to the spirit of the French Revolution and French Enlightenment. In Haiti, the slaves in the country rose up to fight French colonial powers. As one of the leaders of the revolution pertains, this uprising took place at least partially as a direct response to freedoms and ideals of the French Revolution and the 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens. However, the declaration was never intended for the slaves, and yet, in the context of Haiti, it was the slaves who answered the call. Now, Martel states that this response opened the intentions that this response opened the intentions of the revolutionary acts and further extended the call to oppose the power of the kings and aristocracy from the bourgeoisie to the working class. It was the Haitian slaves who inspired the working class and turned French Revolution into a world-changing event. So one can ask, of course, where or indeed how can such an act of misinterpolation take place, or how can one know if it is indeed about the act of misinterpolation? And Lacan suggests two strategies, again, of how we can go about talking about this, or thinking about it, such actions. And on the one end here is the acting out, and on the other end is the passage à l'acte. And this is where I now move on to. No, I don't move on to it entirely just yet. There's one caveat here before I say that. So obviously the passage à l'acte, and as you know, and acting are linked up with anxiety. Now anxiety is very much linked in the notion of prohibition, and equally, many argue that anxiety is more of a pacifying experience. That is, it is more likely to deter the subject from acting or from taking action than to push them to act. However, I argue that the moment of anxiety can lead subjects to act politically, and in doing so, either perform an act of misinterpolation or passage à l'acte. I ground this understanding of acting out in the relationship between the unconscious and politics, as nevertheless it is the relationship between the subject and the other that co-forms the unconscious. And I know just a note on this relationship between politics and unconscious here. So seminar 14 on the logic of fantasy, Lacan makes an observation about the status of the unconscious. He says the unconscious exists. It is motivated by the structure, that is, by language. In other words, it is not only that the unconscious ties the subject to the language, but that the unconscious is dependent on the structure of language. This can lead to the conclusion that Lacan's statement, the unconscious is structured like a language, is only a more refined statement of the unconscious's politics, as has been discussed a number of times. It is the unconscious that splits the political space on that which is inside and that which is outside. And as we know, politics is very much obsessed precisely with splitting a space on the inside and on the outside. So how to bring these two, perhaps, statements about politics together? If there is politics in the unconscious, this politics can only be understood in strictly Freudian terms. So unconscious is politics when it is in a pursuit of authority, in Freudian terms, the father, when it is hinging on the father. In other words, political act in the unconscious is one in which a signifier seeks a relationship with a master, with the master signifier, or with the authority. It is a process which strives to one end, and that is political recognition. The starting point of politics, however, or psychoanalysis, or at least politics in psychoanalysis, however, is not the father or authority, but the unconscious as that which needs to be defined. So, the starting for authority in what determines the subject and is what determines the subject, and is also where the negation for the form of recognition and a political mandate is to take place. Politics in Lacanian sense constitutes the unconscious, the unconscious negations, which, when translated into signifying chains and forms of political recognition, position subjects in relation to authority. Thus, politics is not emancipatory, but precisely the opposite. It is how one becomes the subject of a despotic regime. It is a negotiation in which the subject is put in relation to the primary repressed signifier, in which the subject seeks that which could come into place instead of the primary repressed. It is a politics which aims to leave a mark by making itself visible, by ordering the subject, or by making the subject visible in a despotic order. Thus, in the exclusionary logic of unconscious politics, some political subjects become visible in a despotic regimes, whereas others remain non-existent. The logic of political recognition and identification works on the principle of the political unconscious, and such logic of politics and political action is different from most theories of emancipation, resistance, and protest. So now, to go into the notion of passage à l'acte and acting out. In Lacan's theory, there are these two forms of action, and I align them with what I previously described, acting politically and taking political action. Now, the two strategies of resistance to sovereign authority come at the back of the experience of anxiety, which pushes the subject to make the ultimate shift in its symbolic order. That is, the subject has come to realize how porous sovereign authority is and wishes to call it into question, although we know that this is never a conscious decision or a rational decision in that sense. In the acting out, the subject performs what Lacan would call a hysteric move of opposition to sovereign authority. Such a performance of opposition to the sovereign can derail the symbolic order, but in effect it ultimately reinstitutes the sovereign in the same or in somewhat different yet similar way. It is this act that Lacan in 1968, in his talk to the students in Vincent, described as resist but all you get is a new master. Now, in contrast, passage à l'acte stands for a transgression of the symbolic order. It stands for a break with the sovereign logic, with the way in which the subject has been interpolated and recognized as a political subject. It is a moment when the subject escapes the symbolic network and dissolves the social bond. In effect, this action also makes or marks the end of to the subject. It stands for the symbolic death, its refusal to participate in the network of symbolic power relations and in the reinstatement of sovereign authority. Now, this action leads an individual to the limits of that which is possible to comprehend, and further, its action not only dissolves the authority of the sovereign or a signifier, but also does away with the subject itself. Now, in this move, however, the usefulness of subject's action, and I say usefulness under massive quotation marks here, can always be questioned. Are subject's actions as simple whimsical refusal of sovereign authority, the institution of a different symbolic order, or something entirely new, so the emergence of kind of a new imaginary, new symbolic order, the new world. It's difficult to determine what can emerge from such an act. Speaking of acts of resistance and revolution, Zizek, for example, often asks this annoying question. I mean, we've been repeatedly asking that question today, which is what will come the day after? The day after the revolution, when the sovereign is gone, what will take place? What will take place then? Now, if passage à l'acte leads to the emergence of this new world, then one will lack discourse to really describe it, as it will appear in a threshold of this discursive order. But if it is a return of a new master, then the act will lose its radicality. So when framed in such terms, what world will emerge the day after when framed in such terms, what will emerge the day after is indeed kind of an impossible question. And also, I mean, these are kind of a large-scale question that is, they strive to uncover a new ordering logic in a way, or deter us from seeking it, and form new relations between the signifiers, or setting up different ways of achieving political recognition. Now, while these tasks remain crucial, they are everyday actions that pierce sovereign's authority, and everyday political actions which challenge practices of discrimination, for example, or exclusion, or precisely the way in which the lines between inside and outside are being drawn. James Motel, for example, puts this in slightly differently. He says that the practice of misinterpolation suggests that there are always some people who turn up unexpectedly and unannounced, and who remind us that the political recognition and sovereign authority is not as stable, coherent, and impenetrable as one often imagines. So now here move on to the last part. 10 minutes? Do you have 10 minutes?
Yeah, you have 5. But
okay. I try for 7.5. So, taking on such a practice of misinterpolation in the context of passage à l'acte, I would argue that this constitutes a moment when a subject is not taking a political action but is acting politically. So acting politically exposes that it's not only the subject who experiences anxiety, but the structure of the social political reality with modern liberal democratic state as its derivative is in a way anxious as well. Thus, misinterpolation is a moment when a subject is acting politically does not present a complete rejection of the liberal universalism with rights, privileges, and duties it stands for, but rather, and here I drew on Martel, again, the misinterpolation is generated from within the apparatus of ideology and represents major and crucial misfunctions of that system. In refusing not to be the subject of the call, for example, the Haitian revolutionaries did not show that the liberal universal was capacious enough to contain everyone, to contain everyone. Rather, they show that liberal universalism's bogus principles could be grounds for their subversion and ruination, producing a completely different political outcome and process. So the internal act of subversion is what makes misinterpolation politically powerful. The act itself makes 3 interrelated points, I suppose. It exposes the inner logic of dominant ideologies, and in doing so presents its flaws. It denies the sovereign the power to complete an act of interpolation, which on the one hand reproduces a subject that was not meant to exist, and on the other hand questions the authority of the sovereign. And finally, the act introduces a moment of chance, that is, however, not a chance of catching the moment of misinterpolation, but rather having courage to take a chance and internalize the possibilities of misinterpolation. Now, in the moments when the subject refuses to hear the sovereign, in an intended way, and again, this is never a conscious, decision. It's always a political space opens up, offering a subject a chance to assert itself as being an entirely different kind of subject that what is usually produced through a process of interpolation. So the act of interpolation, however, as we know, is never complete. It's always assumed and dependent on the subject to recognize itself in the call. It is grounded in the assumption that the subject seeks a mandate, but when the subject takes on a mandate, it was never to have, or when it refuses to take on one, those are then the moments in which the moments with political potential. All right. So then I try to use this in the context of the recent, or most recent struggles for racial justice in the U.S. By particularly focusing on Black Lives Matter. I mean, there are, suppose, two key important moments in understanding why I think this is a case this is a political moment which is actually quite important, or where misinterpretation can take place, and one is the time in which Black Lives Matter emerged. So Black Lives Matter emerged in the aftermath of police shooting of unarmed American boys and young men in the U.S. And this was the time that, for many centrist liberals, this moment kind of really caught many centrist liberals in the U.S. by surprise. And it's because the President Obama, for example, at the time was in his second term in office and really enjoying high popularity among American people. So a campaign with strong racial undertone was in a way unexpected. Thus, this unpreparedness of majority population for a political and social movement of such proportions can only be accounted for if the assumption of the existence, for example, of a post-racial society in the United States is taken seriously. So many scholars of African American protest movements, civil rights, and critical race theory write about the ideological undertones that took over the state with Obama's presidency. And that ideological hurdle in becoming, that ideological undertone can only be described as kind of a self-congratulatory way of overcoming a final hurdle in becoming a post-racial society. Now, that undertone, however, was experienced differently depending on one's status in the society. If white liberals celebrated a long-coming victory, for example, African American communities largely saw this time as a moment of political opportunity to fight for what white liberals thought their fellow African American citizens already have. So this tension between what one is thought to be and what one actually is opens a possibility of misinterpretation and a chance to take action and at least expose the fallacy of this post-racial fantasy. The misinterpretation in the context of African American political subjectivity then is played out at two levels. On the one level, and here I draw on Du Bois and Fanon and the idea of double consciousness. So the black subject always misfits the social and political, and the social as the political context, because for example, Du Bois describes this in a sense that the black man is sort of a seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One never feels this two-ness, an American, a black man, two souls, two thoughts, two reconciled strivings, two wearing ideals in one dark body, whose dark strength alone kept it from being torn asunder. So this duality that is being revealed in this political moment, and the other moment is the whole kind of performativity of the law itself, of the kind of the performativity of the law itself, of the law itself, and the taking literally, some of the claims that Black Lives Matter were voicing. So, for example, some of the key chants of the Black Lives Matter are like "I too am an American," Black Lives Matter. And those words are like, they mean nothing, but at the same time, their literal meaning is precisely what, in a way, highlights the lack of rights, or the banality of their claims. So the banality of this being recognized as a political being, of that banality of being recognized as as a subject, as a human, as a person with rights, as a person with, to whom laws should apply. And I argue that misinterpolation in a way works in this context in precisely in this way, by exposing this banality of the action. And I'm just going to finish. I got 5 lines to finish off. So it's not actions of epochal proportions that challenge and alter the political space in the sovereign domain, but internal subversive demands exposing the inner logic of exclusion and inequality reproduced by liberal ideologies that informs changes in the structure of power. So acting politically in a subversive act. So acting politically is a subversive act for as long as it pertains to a particular context, poses an inner challenge to the structure of authority, and is triggered by misinterpolation of the subject and further insist on or persist in its challenge regardless of the costs. Or as Martel writes, if misinterpolation is a form of refusal, a refusal to go away, a refusal not to be subject of a call, a refusal itself may not be the end of the story. This refusal itself could repress or render invisible or certainly misrecognized a multitude of ways of being and acting, so long as we continue to insist that we really are who we said or called to be. And I'll finish with that. So thank you. Sorry? Fine.
Thanks so much. So I have a question. I suppose it's for both papers, but more specifically, Andreas made me think that I should raise it. In some ways, it's about the structure of retroactivity that came up in both of the presentations. And Andrea, since you brought up the graph of desire, I wanted to ask you to say, maybe bring up the way that what you were sort of saying at the end of the paper, like how you would graph it. Because it seemed to me that this distinction between, on the one hand, acting politically would be somehow at the lower level of the graph, right? It would just be kind of between the kind of imaginary identifications that happen at kind of the bottom level, right? Between these like egoic dealings with sort of the image of the other. And then at the upper level, right, once you would kind of pass the sort of first bar, that you only enter that level with this idea of what it means to act politically. So then would the idea be that, I mean, in some ways I'm just trying to get you to sort of return to the beginning, because you gave us this really nice map, but then in the example you didn't maybe elaborate like how that fits with what you started with. And I think it's quite clear and really interesting that, you know, the very line, Black Lives Matter, if we were to sort of map this just as a quilting point, like Black Lives in the left part and Matter on the right part, just as one giant kind of quilting point. What that would mean is that this dimension of expectation, one doesn't expect in the age of Obama that one has to say Black Lives Matter, right? But then it's precisely the fact that one does have to say that creates this whole other dimension, this sort of moving to the upper level of the graph, the place of desire, the place of lack, the place of really exposing this. So I suppose it's more of a comment, but I found it a really interesting kind of invitation for thinking about how we could actually really move to using the graph. And so if you could say a little bit about that and the dimension of expectation, and also retroactivity. Because I think this is one of the ideas, you know, we use retroactivity in this way as if it's always just kind of, you know, looking backwards. But in some ways, your presentation made me think that we really need the concept of retroactivity to move forward, to think of it as actually the kind of projective, future-oriented concept that we get out of theories of the signifier that can be politically mobilized in Lacanian theory. either one of you, if you have any thoughts, comment them. I mean, it's just a way of saying thanks for the great presentations.
I'm just going to give you the first, well, thanks a lot for the comment. I mean, as I said, you know, like, I think you described it perfectly well, how I'm trying to reimagine the graphical desire, and how to kind of map out the protest or the political movement of Black Lives Matter. The issue in a way that I am having is precisely that, you know, as you say, the banality of the chance of recognition for humanity of the life, so basically taking the literal of those claims, is precisely, it's on the first level. Yeah, there is nothing excessive in it, or in the literal statement of those demands. Apart from the voice, for example, apart from the fact that actually they need to be stated, and that elevates them onto, I think, the upper level. The problem that I do have, obviously, is that when I'm trying to read an actual when I'm trying to read a political movement, developing political situation through it, I make some jumps, let's put it that way, that are not, I make some movements that I can't really account for, because of the partly because of the Black Lives Matter themselves, because aside of the chant, you know, the part of the persistent or the beingness or the presence of the movement, there's a lot of ideologically, politically contested ideas that do not transcend the existing political structures, or that are very kind of liberal, you know, so there is certain contradictions there that do not map out. But I think what in a way is important, and I think this is that they still, even despite that, the non-alignment with this kind of radical agenda in every term, they still evoke violence from the state. So they still evoke violence from the state. So that's what I would say for the moment. Can you take to make a question?
Just a comment on that. Yeah. Isn't that happening because the demand that you or maybe other people are making of these movements is already one on the level of representation? So it's like, please rewrite Parliament for us. Why didn't they do it? Well, and of course it would still be a, you know, of course it's if you're looking at these movements in this way, then it's something to concern the system. Like this question of misinterpolation, subject, universality, like it's not a materialist question basically, so it's like always going to stay on the level of discourse and representation.
I mean, the issue, so for example, the issue that I have is that, you know, the demand is often precisely on, you know, it stays on the level of, you know, give us more votes, give us, you know, let's go and vote. It's not about the restructure of the community, it's not about so, you know, if you take the parallels, and I'm not criticizing, I'm not trying to criticize, because I think, you know, it's a really important movement, and I'm fully sympathetic to it. But I think what is really interesting to see is that if, for example, we've got in the whole radical tradition of Black Power, from Black Panthers to whatever, of 1960s and 70s, all that thinking that was behind this movement is lacking in the Black Lives Matter. And it's almost like, you know, it's almost like forgotten. And that's something that, you know, in a way it remains, I don't, So that's what I'm,
But I guess I was curious, are you looking mainly at slogans or also, because there are other things as well.
No, I'm not looking at, I'm
like, for example, people paying bail bonds or
like
those things, for example, are maybe not articulated, you know, maybe they don't articulate changes to the political system, but they nonetheless do something and change.
Yeah, they are entirely new. Yeah, they're entirely new organization, like community organization structure of living or being together. Absolutely, I do.
Thanks for both presentations. I have a question for Andrea. Maybe it's something I didn't understand about kind of misinterpolation. So it's kind of in the Althusserian schema, interpolation involves both recognition and misrecognition. So misinterpolation is, where does that stand? Because it seems to still have to do with kind of recognition, either refusing to be or recognizing oneself in an image that, I don't know, ought not to have been theirs, right? I mean, because it seems to be used. So you mentioned the Haitian revolution, and then I don't know if Black Lives Matter is also kind of, you're considering it at the moment of kind of this kind of misinterpolation. Yeah. So I guess my question is, what kind of subjectivity kind of somehow, what is the subjectivity that somehow emerges from this kind of procedure? I mean, because so is it simply kind of like just like a negative of the Althusserian model, and then you also have subjects, but different kinds of multiple subjectivities that, I don't know, or like a schizophrenia of subjectivity. It's just kind of a question more about maybe I didn't particularly kind of understand how exactly you're using this interpolation, and like in a sense, of course, the question is what would the Lacanian take on subjectivity? How does that fit into this?
So I've been obsessed with trying to think about a subject that's not a subject, a subject that's a different form of subjectivity, subject without the other. I failed that, but in a sense, misinterpolation is basically it is a spread verb. I mean, it's a concept developed by Martel ultimately, and what it does is it's appearing somewhere where one should not appear. So answering a call that it's not meant for you. So in a sense, that means that does that mean that being existing without the other? Or does it put you somewhere on the line between somewhere on the border of say of existing non-existence? I mean, I don't know how to think. Because for Black Lives Matter, for for Education Revolution, at least in this context, the question of responding to a call is still subjectifying yourself. Right? It is kind of answering to a particular call. It's a moment of interpolation, but the refusal comes from the source of the other, right? From the source of the call that refuses that interpolation or that recognition of existence, and yet you persist in it. You persist to take action. So now, is that what kind of subjectivity is that? That is not. I would say that. For the subject, that can be a self-other, but then at the same time it's not, because the other is refusing that particular recognition. So,
do you mind if I? For you, the call in the Black Lives Matter example, or any other example, would be, for example, it was just tiny. I just was wondering. So what would be the call in that, in the Black, because I didn't well understand, just to push it a little bit more.
So in the call in the Black Lives Matter is, the call in the Black Lives Matter is reverse. The call in the Black Lives Matter is claiming, asking for something that you are assumed to have, you are assumed to be, and yet you aren't. So, humanity, for rights, or being a legal subject. Yeah. Because legally, and this is where the universality comes. Universally, of course, law applies to everybody. We are all legal subject allegedly, and yet we are not, because the performativity of the law allows for these distinctions. Right? So here, it's the reverse to what you would have in the Haitian Revolution. Here, it would be that the subject does not feel itself to be part of what they assume to have. So that.
I have one question for Sani about this duplicity of the history that you make about between the constitutive and the constituted history. In the middle of your presentation, you make a kind of division between this kind of history that Benjamin makes about the oppressed history and repression, and the other one, this kind of unconsciousness history that you are describing for us. But I would like to see if it's possible to be a connection between these two kinds of history, how it works. Because sometimes, if I remember some passages of Benjamin's, commodity has a kind of unconsciousness to him. That's a kind of a part of the debate between Adorno and Benjamin about the commodities. Then I'd like to think more about this. It's an important part of the history that you are exposing to us. This this history that constitutes something, and this constituted history. How we can make the connection, if it's possible.
Yes. I think it's possible, and you can't have the one without the other. It made me think why actually I made this diversion to Benjamin at all. I mean, the paper that I gave was more about, you can say, retroactivity in its discontents. I mean, if you can't reach in political action the whatever unconscious mechanism of real abstraction operative in your very action, what's the point then of politically talking about it if it's self-eternalizing itself? So it's kind of a way of how to regain a historical imaginary that can break with what, I don't know, Mark Fisher maybe would have called capitalist realism. And where real abstraction is somehow, you can't get to the operativeness of the second step, which lies before you or behind you, and in an unconscious way modulates everything that you later can represent as history, historicization, and then of course you can engage in the, let's say, more liberal discourse of who should get less, mentioning in the history books and who was forgotten and to whom we should give more. I mean, of course, I think Benjamin is not in this discourse. The tradition of the oppressed maybe also be read as the tradition of the oppressed, repressed, both. And it is both in Benjamin, I think, constitutive and constituted repression. You can't have the one against the other. It wasn't meant to introduce a dualism, an undialectical dualism that is not mediated. It was more trying to come to terms with not only a theoretical problem, but it's the problem of what do we have to, how our political action has to change if something in the very efficacy of the commodity form of making countable and counting that which is not homogeneous, but treating it as homogeneous. How do we have to react to this? Or not? Reaction maybe is also a wrong way. Reaction already inscribes itself into the historicization of, like the historical account I could give you of retroactivity. But apart from this, the political question of this is, of course, how to break with capitalism and there's a very old question, and if there is no consistent subject, there's only an inconsistent one with an unconscious historicity, and we can't play that dualistic game of either logical versus genealogical. What would be a political strategy in that to deactivate the efficacy of real abstraction? Or rather, and that's the slightly pessimist ending of that paper, where I'm not really sure, how can we modulate or displace or shift the very grounds of how real abstraction works? It's not, I think I'm not calling for let's get rid of real abstraction. I mean, obviously it's very powerful and it works, but maybe it can work also in a different way. So I'm not calling for the fantasy of making countable which remains uncountable as uncountable. I'm not playing this game. It's not about adding more content to the same structure. So it's not within the logic of representation. But I'm also not calling for evacuating that political field. I think this is maybe there is I think of a connection to Andrea's paper that I think I would say tactically we have to stay in the realm of politics, of course, and of interpolation. I think it's no way of getting out of that. But you know, it is maybe about our positioning, what we are doing with the capitalist relations of production operative in this very field.
Maybe, actually, I mean, maybe this is just a supplementary question to the last one, and it's it maybe touches on the relation between the two papers, but in particular, it's for Sammy, and it's, I mean, I guess it's, you were just hinting at it now, and it's where you got at the end of the paper, but I mean, I guess one of the things that at least was under stressed was the notion of practice. So, I mean, so that in particular, so with real abstraction, I mean, so the dimension of practice there was sort of more emphasized on the way in which it, you know, the value itself with structures in advance, how one enters into exchange, you know, practically. In other words, how one is always already structured in one's activities by the very form of abstraction that then produces the exchanges that make possible then use. So you're like emphasizing obviously this inversion between use and exchange that structures real abstraction. Anyways, but then you turn to at the end towards and you raise the question of the proletariat, and at that point then I guess the question would be is the practice of you know, class struggle. Can one understand practice, how it operates politically in that way, in the same way that one enters into social exchanges and practices on the level of the commodity form? You know, emphasizing the beginning of the first chapter of Capital. So that in other words, if one wants to attack the problem as you are at the level of form, so it's not a question of change, we have to actually begin to think of practice that can precisely institute something like a passage to the act, but then is also again situated at the level of a symbolic transformation. Do we have to then think a differentiated notion of practice between, on the one hand, the form of social exchanges that we enter into that structure how we act, you know, as being subjects of, you know, capital when we enter into social exchanges, versus then political action, which would have then perhaps, you know, not simply quantitative but qualitative different form of practice. I mean, maybe I'm not formulating the question very clearly, but...
No, I got it. I think that is also the horizon of the question of the paper anyways. I'm not sure about it, and it oscillates in the end. I mean, the paper ends in a way, at least the editor to which I sent it to said that it's a rather pessimistic ending, because there is no way of, so if there's an unconscious of the commodity form, and I even go that far and say that it's more like Urverdrängung, then yeah, what's the point? I won't reach it anymore. And what's then the space of politics? Is that already prescribed or prescribed in such a way that I can only act as a liberal subject within that representational sphere of politics, and that would be my very poor notion of practice then.
Or is there a kind of transformative action that could reach that far and could at least change the parameters of that causes that primal repression? So obviously you won't get rid of primal repression, or you won't get rid of constitutive alienation. You won't get rid of that. But maybe you can modulate it in a certain way and put it to different use. So it's more of a Brechtian point that I make, quite surprisingly maybe, but it's more like Umfunktionierung, like a refunctioning, yet in a non-intentional way. I don't think there's any way of getting a direct grip on that dynamic. I also strongly disagree actually with Sonreto. I use him because obviously he was the one who coined that real abstraction. I think after thinking about it again, I think Ilyenkov would be much better comrade here in that argument. As also I don't like Sonreto's editing out of Hegel, out of Marx. The problem is also that real abstraction doesn't reside in the circulation sphere or through exchange. The notion of abstract labor is a dialectical one and so forth that entails both production, reproduction, and exchange. And it is not so much I'm into real abstraction the moment I engage in exchange. Marx says it 100 times in Capital. It's a purely social relation, abstract labor in this kind of dynamic fall where it's always too less and too much, because value doesn't exist. Value only exists as surplus value. That's a strange thing. So the whole problem of real abstraction is this kind of pull or draw factor that can never be stabilized and say, okay, real abstraction is this third term where abstractions are really performative and real, and apart from real abstraction there's intellectual abstraction here and you know real material sensuously or empirically measurable conditions on the other hand, like these three types. So of course this is not the case, it's all together, it's only on an analytical way, or it's by way of analysis that I can actually distinguish between them. So I'm not saying, so this distinction, how in theory I reproduce the very fact, awkward, obscure fact of real abstract, doesn't give me any clue on where I could actually intervene. Let's say, what would be a politics of real abstraction? Obviously, real abstraction is about practice, it's a purely social relation, unconscious, insofar it is independent of intentional political behavior. So, but then what is the point of it? How could I non-intentionally change retroactively the parameters that make real abstraction so operative, so successful, so powerful, and so economic? So it would be less about how to deactivate the whole machine, or how to start better forms of subversion or of resistance, but more about how this could be put to a better but less destructive use. It's very modest proposal at this point. I'm not thinking we can get rid of real abstraction. It's also kind of something that probably comes into being with this kind of conjuncture of modernity / postmodernity we're still in. So I'm not ontologizing it, but I'm also not saying it is something that cannot be changed as humans make their own history. And of course, Marx also gives this disclaimer, yet not under their own chosen terms. So practice, it is practical. That's the problem. Real abstraction.
Unless there's more pressing questions, I think everybody would like to actually have a coffee. Thank you.